strength, discipline, obedience. These weren't virtues in ancient Sparta. They were the lifeblood of an empire forged in blood and silence. While Athens filled its theatres with laughter and poetry, Sparta echoed with the clash of spears and the cries of boys learning that mercy was weakness. To be born Spartan was to belong to the state before you ever drew breath. And when you failed, when you faltered, disobeyed, or disappointed, Sparta had only one cure: pain. The Spartans are remembered for valour, for Thermopylae, for warriors who fought to the last man. But their true story is far darker. Beneath the gleaming bronze and disciplined ranks lay a world of ritualized horror, where death was spectacle and the gods demanded blood for every act of defiance. In this story, you'll walk the blood-stained stones of the pit of cowardice, where the unwanted were hurled into endless night. You'll stand at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where faith was measured by how long a child could scream. And you'll witness the execution of cowards, broken and erased from memory by the very society they were born to defend. This is Sparta. Not the myth, not the legend, but the nightmare beneath the armour. And once you've seen what the Spartans did to the unworthy, you'll never see their heroism the same way again. High in the shadows of Mount Taygetus, the wind screams through a fissure in the rock, a dark abyss known as the cowardice. To outsiders, it's nothing but a chasm, but to the Spartans, it was the city's open mouth, forever hungry for weakness. The cowardice was not myth. Archaeologists have found it, and within it, the bones of men, women, and even infants mingled with rusted chains and fragments of bronze. Each one tells the same story, that Sparta did not simply kill, it erased. Every Spartan child was judged at birth by the elders of the Gerousia. Midwives would wash the newborn, lift it toward the light, and present it to the council. If the baby was strong, limbs straight, voice loud, it was granted a mother's embrace. But if the infant seemed too frail, too quiet, or imperfect, the elders nodded. That single gesture sealed the child's fate. The father was then commanded to carry the infant to Taygetus. He would climb in silence, clutching the child as the city disappeared behind him. And when he reached the cowardice, he would offer the child to the mountain, a living sacrifice to the perfection Sparta demanded. No graves, no names, just a cry swallowed by the wind. Over time, the pit became something far more than a place for unwanted infants. It became a courtroom for the condemned. Traitors, deserters, and even rebellious helots were led there in chains. Some were pushed in blindfolded, others forced to stare into the black maw before being hurled into it. The sound of bodies striking stone was said to echo for minutes, a grim reminder to those who remained above. But the horror didn't end there. There are accounts of condemned men who didn't die on impact. They broke bones, shattered ribs, but remained alive, trapped in the darkness, their screams seeping through the cracks of the mountain. The pit didn't just kill, it devoured slowly. Priests would sometimes perform purification rites afterward, offering olive oil and ashes to cleanse the polis of impurity. For Sparta believed every flaw, physical or moral, was a disease that could infect the collective. The cowardice was their medicine. When modern archaeologists finally descended into the pit, they found hundreds of human remains spanning centuries. The bones were not soldiers fallen in battle, but citizens. Evidence of state-sanctioned terror disguised as purification. The cowardice was more than an execution site. It was the embodiment of Sparta's most sacred idea, that perfection was worth any price. To die was acceptable. To be unworthy was unforgivable. And as the wind howled through that cavernous mouth, it carried the whispers of the condemned, reminders that even a society built on strength cannot bury its own cruelty forever. At dawn, the temple of Artemis Orthia stirred with the smell of incense, sweat, and fear. Boys stood stripped to the waist, their eyes fixed on the goddess's statue, a grotesque wooden idol, its face carved in a grimace. Behind them, Spartan elders held whips soaked in oil and knotted with bone. This was no act of punishment, it was worship. The ritual was called the diamastigosis, meaning the scourging. Each year, the strongest boys of Sparta were brought before the altar to prove their devotion through suffering. They were not chained, they did not run, they simply stood and endured. When the signal was given, the first lash fell. The whips tore open flesh, sending crimson arcs through the morning air. The boys were forbidden to scream. To cry out was to disgrace one's family. To collapse was to die in dishonor. So they clenched their jaws and stood motionless as the priests called for more. This was the heart of Spartan education, the agoge, where children were molded into warriors. Every stroke of the lash was a lesson. Pain was strength. Mercy was corruption. But the diamastigosis wasn't just for boys. Over time, the ritual expanded to include criminals, slaves, and even cowards. The temple became an execution ground in all but name. Those who displeased the gods or defied the laws were whipped to death before the altar. Their blood was considered a divine offering. Roman travelers centuries later described the spectacle with both awe and disgust. Tourists gathered from across Greece to watch the ritual, cheering as boys fainted and bled. The temple stones turned black from the blood that soaked them, and still the Spartans called it purification. One account describes a youth named Theagenes, who stood through thousands of lashes before collapsing, smiling faintly as he died. His name was carved into a pillar, a symbol of holy endurance. Others weren't so fortunate. Some were left disfigured, their skin flayed into ribbons, their backs forever scarred reminders of their devotion. For the Spartans, blood was proof of faith. The goddess did not ask for prayers, she demanded agony. Even centuries after Sparta's fall, the Romans kept the temple as a relic. Tourists came to see where boys once learned to bleed for their gods. They called it barbaric. The Spartans had called it necessary. And perhaps that's the darkest truth of all. The line between worship and torture had long since vanished. And the people who called themselves the purest among men had built their purity on screams. In a world obsessed with strength, the worst fate for a Spartan was not death, it was disgrace. A Spartan who fled from battle was branded a traitors, the trembler. That word carried more venom than any insult in Greece. It stripped a man of his name, his honor, and his place in the community. The traitors was marked immediately. His beard was half-shaven, a visible scar of cowardice. He could no longer eat at communal tables or speak in assemblies. If he tried to marry, no woman would have him. If he tried to trade, no one would buy from him. Children threw mud at him in the streets. But the shame was not always enough. In some cases, especially after great defeats, the city demanded atonement. And for Sparta, atonement meant blood. The traitors was dragged to the agora, the public square, where he was surrounded by citizens who had once called him brother. He was stripped of his cloak, forced to stand beneath the statue of Lycurgus, the mythical lawgiver, and face judgment. The sentence was often stoning. Sometimes it was worse. The first stones were thrown by boys, the next generation of warriors, taught to see mercy as corruption. Then came the women, the elders, and finally, the soldiers. Each strike broke not only bone but identity. The traitors' death was a cleansing of the city's shame. Other times, cowards were sent to the cryptia, the secret police, who executed helots and traitors under the cover of darkness. The traitors would be told to run. The hunt could last for hours, sometimes days. When caught, he was mutilated, eyes gouged, limbs broken, before his throat was slit and his body left for animals. His family was forbidden to mourn. His name was erased from Spartan records. To the state he had never lived. To be forgotten was the final punishment. Worse than death, worse than pain. It meant eternal silence. Every Spartan mother taught her sons the same words before war. Return with your shield, or on it. Because returning without it was not survival, it was treason. And so in Sparta, fear was the greatest weapon. It forged heroes, but also turned men into executioners of their own. By the 4th century BCE, the iron heart of Sparta began to rust. Its rigid laws, its merciless discipline, the very foundations that had once made it invincible, began to consume it from within. After centuries of war, Sparta was a ghost. The population had withered. The number of true-born Spartans, once in the tens of thousands, fell below 1,000. To fill the ranks, they began granting citizenship to outsiders, a betrayal of everything the old laws stood for. Fear became paranoia. Kings accused their own ephors of conspiracy. The crypteia prowled at night not just for helots, but for citizens suspected of disloyalty. Executions multiplied. The pit of cowardice, once used for the unworthy, now swallowed the powerful. The gods that once justified Sparta's cruelty fell silent. Artemis's temple stood empty, her altar blackened with centuries of dried blood. The youth, once raised to endure, now questioned why they suffered. The answer never came. Then in 371 BCE, at the Battle of Leuctra, the illusion of Spartan invincibility shattered. The Thebans broke the Spartan phalanx for the first time in history. Hundreds of Sparta's finest fell, their legendary courage drowned in blood. Those who survived returned home in disgrace. The city, following its own code, executed many of them as traitors, cowards unworthy of burial. The once mighty warrior state had begun to execute itself. When Rome finally arrived, Sparta was a relic, its cruelty remembered, its glory exaggerated. The pit was silent, the whips hung unused. The iron discipline that once ruled Greece had become an echo. But if you stand today on Mount Taygetus and listen to the wind rush through the stones, you might still hear it. The faint sound of crying, of steel on flesh, of a city that built its greatness on fear and died worshipping it. Sparta's downfall was not a tragedy of conquest. It was the inevitable result of a people who believed strength could replace compassion, and that pain could replace faith. Because in the end, the strongest city in Greece did not fall to enemies. It fell to the gods it created, and the blood they demanded.